So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Brown, and I'll be introducing the speaker. So Professor John A. Erwin is an assistant professor of law at Florida International University College of Law. Combining his legal training with his background as a conservation geneticist, Professor Erwin's research is situated at the intersection of environmental law, genetics, and conservation biology. As a scientist, he has experience doing fieldwork, wet lab genetics, and bioinformatics. He has worked with a variety of species, from freshwater mussels to jaguars. His legal scholarship covers topics such as federal endangered species law, genetic engineering for conservation, and state management of predators. His publication record spans both law reviews and peer-reviewed scientific journals. Professor Erwin received both his J.D. and Ph.D. in genetics from the University of Arizona and a B.S. in Biology and Biochemistry from Washington and the University.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I'm thrilled. It's nice to walk across campus and see some new faces, talk to scientists again. It's been all of my time with law students. To be completely honest, I wasn't totally sure how to approach this talk. I told the students at lunch that we give very different style seminars in law than other disciplines. So this may be a little non-traditional, but hopefully I'll hit the important points. So I've titled the talk, Integrating Science and Law Through the Lens of Conservation Genetics. So I'm going to talk about a range of different projects, trying to take what I've done as a scientist and what I see kind of in the scientific literature and use it to spur improvement of law and policy, really all for the purpose of wildlife conservation. I think the heart of my scholarship is really trying to translate and integrate novel understandings of evolutionary biology and genetics into some sort of improved conservation law and policy. So let's see, do we flip? There we go, the slides work, lovely. So I've got a little outline in place just to keep us on task. So I'll talk about myself briefly, how I moved from science into the legal academy. I promise it will be relevant to the rest of the talk. Then I'll try to frame my research agenda in a way that I think makes some conceptual sense out of these diverse trainings and some of the disparate projects I work on. I'm going to try to draw you the philosophical through line that ties a lot of my research together. Try to highlight how I view wildlife conservation as a science and how I understand its intersections with law and policy. Then I'll zoom into just a couple of specific projects. I think most of the work I'm doing right now falls under two big buckets. Either projects kind of looking at what does it mean to be an endangered species? Or maybe even broader, what should we be conserving? I've got a lot of projects, kind of past, present, and future, that are really all coming at this question from slightly different angles. As part of this, we'll spin off and talk about biotechnology for conservation for just a little bit. And then we'll close up with a little bit about predator hunting and some projects that I've worked on related to predator management. So, okay, I hope you'll let me be just a little self-indulgent and talk about myself, just to explain who I am and what I do and how I see things. So I told the students at lunch this, but I started graduate school with the intention of being a biologist forever. I wanted to do mountain lion conservation, so I went out west to work with mountain lions, with the mountain lion geneticist specifically. And the projects I worked on and the experiences I gained from working with federal and state agencies made me increasingly interested in the policy questions. So I liked the field work, I liked the lab, I liked the computational side of research, but philosophically, I just became less interested in doing basic scientific research and more interested in thinking about how our understanding of the research we do actually gets applied into law and policy. So I started law school at the same time and just continued that path. And now I work full-time at the law school doing this at the intersection of conservation biology and law. All right, so let me try to paint you a picture of what I saw and how that influenced my own trajectory and the work I do today. When I was just a biologist, this is kind of how I used to think about our conservation framework. And this is often how it's taught or it's framed in the literature. So scientists, we do basic and applied research that ideally informs conservation and management actions for wildlife. And I say ideally because there's a lot of literature out there highlighting how my field, specifically conservation genetics, is quite poor at translating some of our work into management actions, hence the dashed red line. But either way, the success or failures of our management action ideally give rise to new issues and new questions, which in a perfect world come with some grant money attached. So these questions then drive the applied and basic research, filling out the loop. And this gap between empirical research and management actions, I think, is a shame, because conservation genetics as a field is really helpful for understanding a lot of questions that managers and policymakers are interested in. Things like determining conservation or taxonomic units, elucidating population structure, barriers to gene flow, documenting hybridization, determining presence or absence of species, understanding adaptation to different environments, estimating population sizes, things like wildlife forensics, or even understanding the behaviors and relationships of wildlife. All of this can come from genetics. But while a lot of my work as a scientist was aimed at kind of this red dashed line, trying to do research that would translate into and inform on-the-ground conservation, my experiences in grad school interacting with these agencies and then my time in law school led me to realize that the law and policy often lived outside of this loop, but had significant effects on each kind of step. So federal and state law can set up funding mechanisms to incentivize different types of research, right? By directing funding, law and policymakers are directly influencing what knowledge is going to be developed. Similarly, this law can affect research more directly. Law can specifically outlaw or limit certain types of research. Within the wildlife world, the Endangered Species Act affects what you can do with samples, what kinds of data and samples you can collect, how you can share them. It requires permitting to get around these regulations. But I think most importantly is how the law directly controls our conservation and management actions. So federal and state wildlife laws direct the agencies on which species they should or shouldn't protect. They direct agencies on how much time, money, effort, or restrictions can be used to protect species. The law dictates which conservation tools and management techniques are legal and which are not. The law guides managers on what factors they're allowed to consider when they make decisions. So I think this is really important if we want to understand how research gets turned into action. Agencies may be legally forced to consider factors other than scientific data when making decisions about wildlife conservation, or they might be limited in what kinds of data they're allowed to consider. Law is effectively the structure through which our societal values act as guide rails around this entire wildlife conservation endeavor. But for the system to work well, it shouldn't be unidirectional, right? Science has to also affect the implementation and crafting of law and policy. So how do we take what we learn from scientific research and use it to better craft better law and policy? So even if decisions might be really value-laden policy choices, can we at least make sure that scientific information is available and considered when decisions are made? Can we make sure that science isn't being used to obfuscate and to shield agencies when they make difficult value-based decisions? Can we make sure that statutes and regulations don't impose limitations or restrictions that are disconnected from biological reality? And these are the kinds of questions I hope my research is trying to aim to address now. So boiling down from the really kind of fluffy theoretical to maybe something a little more concrete, a lot of the work I do is really focused on these two questions. What should we protect and how should we manage the entities we decide to conserve, right? These are the two questions that are at the heart of my scientific work, but all of my legal scholarship is spun out of these scientific projects that I worked on. So for example, one of the main types of research conservation genetics as a field is useful for is for delineating units of conservation. So genetics is very good at determining when a group of organisms possesses unique genetic markers or is otherwise genetically distinct from other groups of organisms. So one of the big projects I worked on as a graduate student was with black-tailed prairie dogs. Prairie dogs in Arizona had been extirpated back in the 1960s, but a fear of listing under the Endangered Species Act created an incentive for the state to attempt to do a reintroduction. So in this project, we were trying to understand what kinds of prairie dogs used to live in Arizona. Specifically, it was a question of whether they were a separate subspecies. So we sequenced DNA, did double digest rad-seq from samples from museums as well as across the rest of the range to show that prairie dogs in Arizona seem to be genetically distinct from prairie dogs across other portions of the range. Also have a paper came out fairly recently on crested caracara in Florida. So we were trying to understand whether the caracara in Florida were different, either a distinct population or separate subspecies than caracara found throughout the rest of their range. We found they were quite distinct, likely isolated from the rest of their range since the Ice Age. Other scientific projects I worked on are related to this question of how should we manage species once we've decided to conserve them. So I'll talk about pumas a little bit later in the talk, but we did a study looking to understand the effects of sport hunting on mountain lion populations in Colorado. As another example, we got a project on bighorn sheep. We saw a very small bottlenecked population rapidly expand. We're trying to figure out, was this based on some sort of management action that happened or was it not? So these are just a smattering of the projects I worked on as a scientist, but they hopefully give you some idea of what that side of my work looks like. And when I was first starting out, I really believed that these questions, what should we conserve and how should we manage, were scientific questions in nature. They could only be answered by better or improved science. Once I started spending some more time out of the lab and at the law school, I gained a different perspective. It became obvious to me that these questions are truly not answerable by science at all, right? Hopefully we can use scientific data that I and many of you and other people are generating to inform these decisions, but the answers to these questions are inherently based on values and other things that we consider. So the law creates this structure that we can mix the scientific data with our societal values to answer these questions and other interesting management and conservation related questions. And that's the balance I'm hoping to now strike with my legal scholarship. This question of what we conserve has been somewhat narrowed and applied through federal and state endangered species laws into what is an endangered species at all. This question of how we manage becomes filtered through state game laws and regulations. So these two big questions are really the launching off point for the legal scholarship I'm going to spend most of the talk on. So a lot of my legal scholarship is really driven by this question: what is an endangered species under the ESA? So specifically, I'll talk a little bit about issues posed by interspecific variation, things like subspecies and distinct populations, talk a little bit about hybridization, and we'll talk a little bit about biotechnology and genetic engineering. So before we dive into this narrow question of what is an endangered species, realize this is not a room full of law students. I'll give you a bit of a primer on the Endangered Species Act. 1973, Congress passed the ESA as we know it today. And despite how controversial and partisan it's become, the act sailed through Congress with support from both parties, signed into law by Richard Nixon. Congress recognized that species were being lost and were going extinct, and that these species have aesthetic, ecological, educational, historical, recreational, and scientific value to the nation and its people. It's important, I think, to recognize the broad range of reasons why Congress felt it was important to prevent extinction, right? These are all values. And this purpose still guides agency decision-making today. So for this reason, the ESA was passed to protect endangered and threatened species, as well as the ecosystems in which they're found. So Congress entrusted two agencies, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, with the implementation of the act. The services were charged with determining which species were endangered and threatened, and thus covered under the protection of these protective provisions of the act. So once listed, these protections kick in. This includes recovery provisions, such as the development of a recovery plan, designation of critical habitat, and it includes extinction prevention provisions. So these are the really teeth of the act, and they include requirements that federal agencies consult with the services before taking actions, and that private parties are prohibited from taking or importing listed species. So we know what legal protections come into play once a species is listed. So what does it take to get on the list? An endangered species is defined as any species which is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. Similarly, 320 defines threatened to mean that species are likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. So there's two major terms of art here. The agency has to determine what is a species, and they have to determine what it means to be in danger of extinction. So most simply, the agencies determine whether a species is in danger of extinction or is likely to become in danger of extinction based on a number of congressionally mandated factors. They think about things like habitat destruction, overharvest, disease, predation, a broad category of other natural and man-made factors. They develop a species status assessment, an SSA, to evaluate past, present, and future conditions of the species. So I'll just say genetics and genomics has become an increasingly important part of developing these SSAs. Information on affected population size, demographic history, population connectivity, inbreeding, genetic diversity, adaptive potential are all relevant as part of this SSA that's used to determine whether a species is endangered or threatened. So decisions about whether a species is endangered or threatened, or whether a group of organisms is a species, for the purposes of the ESA, has to be done on the basis of what's called the best available science, or the best scientific and commercial data available. Traditionally, best just meant only, was whatever happened to be available. But today, sometimes the agency has the opposite problem, too much conflicting information. So while this best available science mandate sounds great in practice, it's often been criticized for allowing agencies to hide the ball, to make decisions based on other factors, insulating them from judicial review. So for example, this quote from Professor Doremus, I think really sums it up. The ESA strictly science mandate rests on the assumption that conservation policy decisions can be made objectively on the basis of existing or reasonably attainable scientific knowledge. Because that assumption is wrong, the mandate has been impossible to implement. This is called the science charade. The criticism of the science charade is especially tied to this question of what is a species? And this is the question that's lurked in the background and occasionally plagued implementation of the ESA. So if I ask you, what is a species? I might get something close to a consensus answer, right? Ernst Mayer's famous biological species concept is the first one a lot of people go to. Phylogenetic species concept is another. But this is law, not biology, right? Congress, rather than a consensus of biologists, have defined the term for us. The ESA merely defines species as including any subspecies of fish or wildlife or plant, and any distinct population segment of any species of vertebrate fish or wildlife which interbreeds when mature. So we can protect species and we can protect subspecies and we can protect whatever the heck a DPS is supposed to be. Congress chose not to define subspecies or DPS, leaving that interpretation up to the agencies themselves. So I'll say clearly this legal definition is broader and incongruent with the scientific definition. But I'll say this puts a massive emphasis on taxonomy when it comes to listing species under the ESA. So if you say you're a landowner and some scientists come on your land and say the turtles in your pond are genetically distinct, they start calling them a new subspecies. They're different than the turtles found in the rest of the country. That subspecies might be listed by the Endangered Species Act, and now you might have to deal with the strict regulations that come with that. If those turtles aren't a different subspecies or a DPS, then they're not going to be protected and there are no consequences. So what we name things, taxonomy, matters quite a bit. And there's difficulty when determining what counts as a species, right? Biologists don't agree, even though there might be one or two definitions we like best. So when scientists are struggling to figure out what it means, so within evolutionary biology, there's something like 30 competing species concepts at any given time. And this is tough. And I'll say this is far more contentious once you start talking about subspecies. There's been very little litigation over is something a species or not, but whether something is a subspecies or distinct population segment has led to a lot of controversy. Why? Well, there's a lot less agreement among scientists about what the appropriate standard is for subspecies. There's significantly different tests that are used routinely across different orders in the animal kingdom. There have been nasty fights in the academic journals, comments in the agency rulemakings, and even federal courts over species like Preble's meadow jumping mouse and the Southwest willow flycatcher. And the rise of genomics is likely to make this set of fights even nastier. So I think this is going to lead to a problem, a legitimacy problem for the agencies. And one recent study actually argued that up to 2/3 of currently listed subspecies are illegitimate by the tests that they prefer to use. So in an era where federal courts have become increasingly skeptical of agencies and agency use of science, this seems like a ticking time bomb for Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'll come back to this idea in a second. But I've seen this in my own work, right? Going back to the projects I worked on with prairie dogs, The questions of whether there were multiple subspecies was highly relevant due to the potential implications of the Endangered Species Act. So historically, black-tailed prairie dogs have been divided into two subspecies, the common Cynomys ludovicianus and the more restricted Cynomys ludovicianus arizonensis. Subspecies were determined in the early 1900s, largely based on skull morphology. Arizonensis has a slightly larger skull and on average, slightly larger auditory bullae. So if you can't spot these differences, don't worry. Most experts couldn't either. One study found that skulls could only be properly grouped about 50% of the time. So these subspecies were in theory geographically located separately as well, one found north of the Pecos River, one found south of the Pecos River. These prairie dogs in the Midwest were quite common, in Arizona and New Mexico, quite rare. If they're a separate subspecies, they can be listed separately, and all of a sudden, those south of the river might be on the list. And so to answer this question, we did genotyping by sequencing, samples from across the range. We looked at nuclear DNA, we looked at mitochondrial DNA, we did niche modeling. And our data suggests that these are potentially distinct groups, that may be 3 instead of 2. But what I really took away from this project was the difficulty in making this taxonomical determination, whether the distinctions we were seeing were sufficient to call these groups separate subspecies or not. The lack of consistency in what that term meant in that definition frustrated me and seems to be frustrating other folks as well. So if I, a biologist studying these things and struggling to define whether my study animal is 1 or 2 subspecies, how does Fish and Wildlife Service make that decision? Well, thus far, the agency has been focused on making very holistic decisions, claiming to include all kinds of things: morphological, karyotypical, biochemical, physiological, behavioral, ecological, biogeographical characters. But in reality, they usually just defer to taxonomists and other biologists. And I think this is going to be a problem soon. So I'll get to why I think it's going to be a problem in a second. I guess I should say something about DPS first. The agencies have a second option for listing subspecific groups. They can call them a distinct population segment. And this is a term that means nothing to biologists. Congress made it up. They used it to be similar to the idea of evolutionarily significant units, so from Robin Waples back in the late 80s. But they added some things. So here you can see the definition. To be a DPS, it has to be discrete and it has to be significant. Well, what's significant? A unique ecological setting. If the loss of range would cause a bigger gap in its range, if it's the only remaining natural occurrence, or this last one, marked differences from other populations based on genetics is the big one that's used often. But it also has to be discrete. They want to see it somehow separate from others. So in genomics is just now starting to play a role here in what is a DPS. So this is the Foothills yellow-legged frog. It's the first DPS listing that's really used genomics in any way. They've ended up saying there's 4 separate DPSs of the Foothills yellow-legged frog. But it's also causing issues for the way the DPS framework has been utilized. So some recent studies have shown that there's a single gene in Chinook and steelhead salmon that controls whether they're fall or spring run. Though they do interbreed, the 2 separate phenotypes are geographically disjunct. Spring run salmon and fall run salmon utilize different streams. Spring run salmon are especially at risk due to dams. So earlier this year, NIMS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, rejected petitions to list these spring run salmon separately from the fall run phenotype. They felt that they lacked sufficient reproductive isolation. They weren't discrete. California Game and Fish came to a different conclusion. They took a broader range of factors to determine that they were separate. But the point being, these kinds of new techniques might say new things are distinct than we knew before, or they might say create some problems for these rigid tests we have, like discreteness. Okay, so I'll just say I'm currently in the middle of an article focused on this question. How does the agency deal with these 2 things? For a long time, they've listed things as DPSs. They have a clear definition of what it means, and they get sued a lot and they lose a lot. On the other hand, when they list things as subspecies, Despite the fact that there's no test at all, they win. They keep winning. Even though folks are starting to perhaps catch on that subspecies doesn't mean a lot. But there's this whole question now, Chevron deference is gone. Won't go too far into the weeds, but if you read the news, that might be a thing you've heard of. And it's going to open up new issues for the agency in terms of what they can rely on and what they can't in terms of experts. So I'm early on this, but working on it. Okay, but it isn't just the words that are included in the statutory definition of species that's caused problem. If I've learned anything from kind of these projects, it's that nature defies a lot of our attempts at categorization, right? The more we learn about evolutionary biology, the messier things get, the more difficult the line drawing we need for law becomes. So I wrote a paper on hybridization, thinking about how the Endangered Species Act deals with hybrids. Traditionally, hybridization was viewed as unnatural, as a danger to conservation. Modern evolutionary theory, genomic techniques, we now know that many species have significant histories of introgression, right? Wolves and coyotes, brown bears and polar bears. Humans even have a genomic signature of admixture. So if we just look at the language of the statute, it's not clear how hybridization fits. Are they a species? Which species are they? Is it one? Is it the other? So I dug through about 10 years of listing decisions to show how the services have been just inconsistent with how they've dealt with this problem and tried to suggest a new approach, thinking about whether protecting the hybrids would benefit the continued existence of the endangered taxa and whether protecting the hybrids benefits the ecosystem as a whole. My most recent publication is about genetic engineering in the Endangered Species Act. This poses a different kind of question for what does it mean to be a species? Comes at it from just a different angle. So in this paper, I focused on the use of genetic engineering to direct evolution of threatened and endangered species. So I argue that in the paper, genetic engineering can facilitate the recovery of some species, allowing us to end perpetual management. So black-footed ferrets been recently cloned for the first time. Ferrets are somewhat famous. Their population got down to 7 individuals. They were brought into captivity. Might have been 13 individuals, but only 7 have contributed to the breeding population today. Brought into a captive breeding program, severely bottlenecked. So how have they dealt with this lack of genetic diversity? Taking tissue samples from before the bottleneck and using it to clone ferrets, and then reintroducing ancestral genetic variation back into the population. So Elizabeth Ann here has more genetic diversity in her genome than all 1,000 ferrets that are alive today. But these biotech questions pose novel issues for us. Are they still endangered species? And if we're worried about protection of the environment, how do we deal with that? So we're going to go down a little bit of a biotech rabbit hole here, but I will pop back to the is it a species question in a second. So a lot of potential uses of biotechnology and wildlife conservation. This Elizabeth Ann cloning example is just kind of the first we've got. There are a bunch of projects now that are focusing on introducing novel heritable changes to a species genome via genetic engineering. There's projects focused on introducing disease resistance to fight things like avian malaria in Hawaiian birds, sylvatic plague in black-footed ferrets. Others are focused on introducing novel adaptations. So coral, right? A lot of folks are familiar with this idea of trying to introduce heat tolerance to coral or resistance to cane toad toxin in species like qualls. There are 2 types of kind of genetic, what we might think of as bioengineering relevant to conservation. The old methods, transgenic engineering, involve taking a gene from one species and putting it into another. The American Chestnut Restoration Project was proceeding along these lines until earlier this year when they ran into some hiccups, all in an attempt to fight chestnut blight. But with the advent of CRISPR and some of these related gene editing techniques, things are changing. Instead of copying and pasting genes, we're now talking about making specific changes within a genome. So one of the trickiest issues when dealing with biotechnology for conservation is that there's a bunch of different techniques that are being deployed in significantly different ways, often for the same purposes. So for the examples I used on the previous slide are all examples of what we might think of as direct interventions, right? Using biotech to redirect evolution by modifying the gene pool of species of conservation concern. But a lot of the most promising uses of these technologies involve modifying other species for the benefit of a species of conservation concern. These are going to be indirect. And indirect interventions provide a different suite of genomic targets and could provide solutions to otherwise intractable problems. So for example, genetic engineering as biological control has gained significant traction in the realms of disease prevention, crop protection, but also potentially wildlife conservation. There's projects kind of spanning the gamut from mosquitoes and ticks that affect human health to, in Australia and New Zealand, invasive mice, cats, stoats. Some projects like Oxitec's friendly mosquitoes use transgenes to effectuate basically a sterile insect style control program. But others are talking about using gene drives to completely eradicate populations and potentially species. Gene drives bias inheritance, right? Allowing significantly deleterious alleles to survive really intense purifying selection and spread through a population despite their potential lethality. I'll say some suppression techniques some techniques that focus on suppression rather than eradication. So there's attempts to make cane toads less toxic. Some of these technologies kind of blur the lines between direct and indirect. Rather than directly modifying coral or say amphibians dealing with chytrid fungus, you could potentially modify their microbial symbionts, right? Skin microbiota for salamanders or dinoflagellates that cohabitate with coral, potentially achieving the same end goal, increasing heat tolerance, protecting amphibians from fungus. Then you've got even crazier things like de-extinction, right? True cloning is probably not going to happen. These efforts have largely stalled. But folks like George Church are saying, well, let's just use CRISPR to modify some of these species. So that's the most prominent example, taking Asian elephants, gene editing them to start looking and acting like woolly mammoths. But there's projects underway for dodos, thylacines, passenger pigeons, etc. But I think what's important here is that conceptually, the variance of techniques and the purposes of these interventions make any sort of like one-size-fit-all approach really difficult in terms of regulation. We're left having to cobble together fundamentally different bodies of law to deal with these kinds of problems. So on one hand, we have things like conservation laws to preserve biodiversity and ecosystems. Laws might be narrowly focused on specific species of conservation concern, like the Endangered Species Act, or they might be broadly focused on protecting land or ecosystems. Think of like the Wilderness Act, wilderness areas, national parks. There's even things like rights of nature that are trying to protect nature itself. I'll see these laws are sometimes narrowly focused on preventing and minimizing harm to listed species and may completely disregard other harms that we're concerned about to humans or the environment at large. Application of these laws presents these theoretical challenges of whether they apply or don't. Say biotech regulation, on the other hand, also has its problems. In the US, it's a product-focused approach where individual biotech-created products are assessed for very specific risks. We have something called the Coordinated Framework that governs biotechnology regulation. It assigns 3 different agencies, the FDA, EPA, and APHIS, jurisdiction over specific kinds of harms. EPA deals with pesticides under FIFRA. FDA deals with food safety, but it uses its new animal drugs authority to regulate all genetic engineering in animals for some reason. And then you've got APHIS, which is focused on agriculture and plant pests. But the takeaway here is that we need to figure out some sort of system of governance where laws designed to protect endangered species work synergistically with laws designed to protect us from negative consequences that might arise from, say, gene drive mosquitoes. Okay, that was a detour, but back to this, what is a species, what do we conserve question. I'll say a lot of what at the heart of this paper and some of my research is focused on whether gene editing can even be used under the Endangered Species Act, or does it violate the purpose and or language of the statute? So I argue for a bunch of reasons in the paper that say modifying a listed organism will result in a listed organism. I know from a text perspective, the statute makes it clear that the services can use all methods available for recovery. Things like the offspring of listed species are explicitly included. Say this interpretation is most consistent with kind of current agency listing practice, appellate court decisions. And I think critically, it's being done for the recovery of species, which is the purpose of the act. So I'll say the paper, I dive into these ideas of wildness and naturalness because they come up quite a bit. I'll just say, make arguments that perhaps these kinds of techniques can make things like ferrets more wild than they currently are, where they're being grown in captive breeding programs, they're still being inoculated. We actually vaccinated black-footed ferrets from COVID. People were out in the field collecting ferrets to give them COVID vaccines. So it's hard to say these things are truly wild already. And I talk about naturalness a little bit and say, these things might certainly no longer be natural, but functioning ecosystems and preserved species, to me, are more important values than naturalness. So, okay, one last bit down this particular rabbit hole. I'll just say the coordinated framework that I showed you earlier. We've got the FDA, we've got APHIS, we've got EPA, all regulating very specific different things. None of those things that I read off sounded anything like ferrets. They don't really fit anywhere else. So I make the argument in the paper that perhaps the Endangered Species Act gives Fish and Wildlife Service some sort of structure to do this kind of work safely. So we talk about using recovery permitting procedures to allow the creation and original breeding in a lab. There's something called the controlled propagation regulations that specifically deal with captive breeding, and they require a genetic management plan that requires biologists and other specialists believing interventions are warranted. Last, there's this thing called experimental population procedures under Section 10J of the EPA or the ESA that basically would allow them to do field testing that's required to be kept separate from other species. So I make the argument in the paper that I think there's at least some sort of structure for Fish and Wildlife Service to do some of this work already in hopefully a safe manner. All right. One half down, we've gone through what does it mean to be an endangered species. So let's spend a little bit of time on how to better incorporate science into state game law. All right. So a lot of my work has been focused on delineating units for conservation, but I've also spent a good amount of time working with mountain lions, mountain lion hunting, and thinking about how our harvest actions affect populations. So I've got a couple papers, a book chapter, the scientific article, and another article that's forthcoming that I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about and make sure I'm leaving plenty of time for questions. So I'll just say, it's a really interesting time right now in predator management. Gray wolves were delisted at the very end of the Trump administration. All of a sudden, states like Wisconsin have statutes on the book that require them to offer a state hunt as soon as the species comes off the endangered species list. Well, they offered their hunt. It lasted 3 days instead of 6 months. Hunters killed between 2 and 3 times more wolves than the agency permitted for in those 3 days.
How many was that they killed?
So there, let's see, almost 215, 300, somewhere in that range. So I think there was 126 is what it was permitted for, and they killed somewhere between 250 and low 300s, depending on how you think about pack disruptions and things like that. So up to about 30% of the wolves in the state. And per the state statute, DNR was expected to offer a hunt in the fall as well. And this led to some interesting lawsuits. Folks were angry and decided to try to challenge. A group of environmental organizations sued based on state administrative law and the public trust doctrine. The tribes, the Ojibwe, also sued, claiming their tribal reserve treaty rights had been violated. So these things ended up back on the list. Courts invalidated the delisting. No hunt occurred in the fall. They're currently listed, though the Biden administration came out a couple weeks ago and said they're actually going to support the rule that delisted. They totally reversed face on it. We'll see how long that lasts. But this Wisconsin experience is really just a microcosm for what's going on a bit more broadly in the US. There are constant attempts to delist things like wolves and grizzly bears, and states plan on offering hunting seasons as quickly as possible. And I don't think this is just an issue with delisting. Predators like mountain lions that have been in state control for decades are now facing totally different hunting regimes than they had in the past. Like states are totally removing quotas entirely, going to open season models. They're legalizing hunting methods that haven't been legal for decades. Some states are reinstituting bounties. Idaho wants to reduce its wolf population by 90%. This is drastic. These are not things that we've seen in 50, 60 years. So something I was interested in, trying to bring the science and the law together, was looking at how might organizations challenge this legally? How have they done it in the past? What's worked and what hasn't worked? So I did a big deep dive into the case law and found a bunch of cases and tried to categorize them and describe what's happened in the past. So a lot of this is very, very legal in nature. I'll skip over most of it. I'll just say the organizations that like to sue have found it very difficult to do for a number of reasons. One, they like federal law much more than state law. Federal law is actually about conservation. State law is about game management. They're fundamentally different purposes. But federal law often isn't applicable unless something is listed, or unless it's a federal agency taking an action, or unless it's happening on federal land. There's no hook for them to litigate based on federal law. So then they turn to state law. What do they find in state law? Not a lot good for them. There's attempts to use kind of informational and procedural hooks. Environmental litigation often proceeds on using procedural hooks to challenge substantive things you want. But there aren't a lot of state procedural laws that gave good hooks either. I was really interested in looking at cases where folks were trying to sue the agency claiming that their science was bad or that they ignored science that they had. And those cases were all routinely failures. So why is that? The takeaways from this paper? Well, what I found through this research is that winning these cases is really hard. The structure of American wildlife law and the nature of state administrative litigation work together to insulate agencies and statutes from review. So I'll touch on each point just a little bit. Just say, one, state agencies are given just really broad delegations. There aren't really standards the legislatures put in place. And there's quite a bit of research that shows that some of these Western wildlife agencies have been captured largely by ranching and consumptive uses of wildlife. So the science is super complex and courts have a hard time dealing with it. So they usually just defer to the agencies, even when there's perhaps good examples of the agencies not having very clear science or not having really any data at all that supports the link between their chosen action and the outcome they want to find. I'll say last, this is all about values, and hunting is valued legally. So I had some suggestions in the paper, but I think they're maybe not, a couple of them are not the most interesting. But let me say something about generating better science. I think this might be a good tie-in. Part of the murkiness of when it comes to predator hunting is that it's really difficult to create good data on cause and effect in predator management. Most of what we have is kind of post hoc observational studies. It's hard to do an actual experiment when it comes to hunting things like mountain lions. And some agencies are trying to change that. So I worked during my PhD with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and they were willing to set aside about a quarter of the state to allow no hunting for a period and then reinstate hunting for another period and actually monitor the changes that were occurring to see if the actions they were taking were rationally linked to the policy goals they had. So one thing I'm hoping to push out into the world is these agencies should be doing this more. They should be doing science by regulation, right? The science has to inform the agency in more ways than one. So, all right, I'll leave it with this. My kind of big conclusions. I know it's all over the place. Hopefully it was something for everyone. But I think the big conclusions are really that our understanding of wildlife in the natural world is going to keep evolving and going to keep changing. Things like genetics will provide us with new information, as is biotechnology. And our wildlife conservation laws and regulations also have to evolve and change based on the new things that we learn. But I don't want you to walk away with this, the science is going to solve all of our problems. As I hopefully have kept coming back to, so much of conservation is really about values. And it's about giving the managers data to help them make rational decisions that are clear to weigh the different values. All right. So because I'm in a room full of scientists, I just want to give a call to action. There's a lot of things you can do to get involved with people like me and policymakers. What might that be? There's things called amicus briefs, where lawyers get together with people like experts who give courts useful information. You can serve as an expert witness. You can comment on regulations. Anyone in this room can go on regulations.gov and give the federal government your thoughts on any rule they have. You can work with recovery teams to do things like SSAs, or you can collaborate with your local law professor who would love to find more people to work with. So, all right, that's my probably overly long spiel that went all over the world. I'd love to take questions. If you want to read any of my work, QR scan it, you can find it online. Thank you.